Hello investigators and welcome to Until Need of Time. My name is Veronica, thank you so much for joining me. Scarlet Key preview season is in full swing and I'm happy to have some more cards to discuss with you. If you've missed my previous videos about Amina, Carson and Kaimani, you might want to go back and watch those, just to make sure you're up to speed for all these new cards I have to share with you. In this video, we're going to be going over 5 newly previewed cards. These cards are courtesy of Miskatonic University Radio, Mythos Busters, Drawn to the Flame, and The Whisperer in Darkness. Links to these channels are in the description and please go check them out. This preview season wouldn't be possible without all of these content creators doing their best, sharing these cards, and generally being excited for the game of Arkham. The first card of the day is Predator or Prey, previewed by Miskatonic University Radio. Predator or Prey is the second dilemma we've seen so far, and the rules text for dilemma, in case you missed the last video, is up on the screen now. The important thing is that they have revelation abilities that trigger as soon as they enter your hand. You do not get to control them, and as soon as they are done, they will get discarded. Predator or Prey is a very interesting card because it has no cost, it is a zero-cost survivor event, has the dilemma and tactic traits. Its being a tactic means Mark could take it. And it has the max 2 dilemma per round, revelation, if there are no enemies in play, draw 1 card. This is just to make sure that this card always does something. Otherwise, you must decide, choose one, each unengaged enemy moves once towards the nearest investigator, or each investigator disengages from each enemy engaged with them and moves once away from the nearest enemy. This is a fascinating card and plays into a classic survivor strategy of messing with enemy movement and messing with mobility. Interestingly enough, it doesn't actually say non-elite anywhere on the card, which means that this is one of the only cards in the game that makes it possible to move elite enemies, which I don't know if intentional. It makes Blood the Altar potentially very easy, but whatever. You know, scenario is like 5 years old now, that's probably okay. And you have very little control over this card if you're just counting on drawing it at the right time, but keep in mind that using cards like Resourceful and adding it to your hand that way does also count. I think this is a fascinating card that has a lot of different utility and playstyle depending on which investigators are in your group. For example, if you're playing this in someone like Rita, you might be using it to get further away from your enemy and get a free move out of this. Whereas if you're using this with, say, Yorick or Mark, getting to move enemies closer to you so that you can then kill them also seems kind of nice. So I love the design of this, and I think this is a slightly easier dilemma to wrap your head around than Heat the Dream, the previous one we saw. So hopefully it'll see a lot of play, and we'll see kind of how this dilemma mechanic works out in practice. I do feel like the dilemmas are very difficult to kind of parse if you've never played with them before. So I'm a little hesitant on actually, giving any judgment because I just don't know how this is gonna play out in the end. Next up, we have Elle Rubash, previewed by the Mythos Busters. Elle is a 3-cost 2 XP Mystic asset with a willpower and agility icon. Her subtitle is Purifying Purpose. She has the ally and witch traits. She can take 1 damage or 2 horror, and she has the ally slot. And I'm going to be reading these abilities in reverse order because I think that makes the most sense. It's quite a complicated text box, but let's go through it one at a time. So her bottommost ability is a free trigger, Exhaust Elle. Choose an asset in your play area with 1 or more doom on it. So the asset needs to have a doom on it. To attach the asset to Elle, or switch it with another attached asset, limit 2 attached assets. Now what does that do with those assets? Well, 1 doom on each attached asset does not count towards the agenda's doom threshold. On top of that, you get +1 skill value while resolving a skill test on the attached asset. Now importantly, the assets attached to her still take up their slots. She does not negate the slot requirement for these various assets. But that still, I think, is a very, very powerful ability to have with someone like Amina. I already talked about her in a previous video. Go back and check that video out if you haven't seen it already. But her ability lets you reduce the resource cost of a card by 3 if you're willing to have it come into play with a doom on it. That is great with Elle. You can have an asset, any asset, come in for 3 cheaper, stick it under Elle, and that doom doesn't count towards the agenda's doom threshold. You won't have to worry about it. You even get +1 skill value while using that asset. And then once the agenda advances and the doom gets wiped away, you could potentially get rid of those, or rather move those assets aside, put different assets under her with Amina's ability. This is unique to Amina. A lot of other mystics can only use assets that bring their own doom, but Amina could potentially put any kind of asset under LA, even just like a Rite of Seeking or something, if she's just trying to play this out for free, and then she gets the skill value boost as well. So this seems like a fantastic ally for her. I already talked about the Dowsing Rod and Ceremonial Sickle in my Amina video, and these cards just seem so much better now that we've seen LA. So not only do they get a stat boost, which I felt like they really needed to be a little bit more competitive, you can now also play around with their Doom abilities so much safer, because as long as there's one Doom on it and not more than that, you don't have to worry. It's the same as having no Doom on them at all. And so you can kind of, push the limits a bit more. Don't worry about it. It's gonna be okay. I think this specifically or explicitly matters a lot more for the Ceremonial Sickle, because what I said in the last video is that you always have to have an enemy around to defeat with the ability so that you can then remove the Doom from it. Well, that's no longer nearly as big of a deal if you have LA, because you can always have one Doom on this and still be safe. So I think the Sickle especially has gone up a lot now that we've seen LA. There are, of course, other synergies as well. Specifically in Amina, her Word of Weal and Word of Woe cards, her two signature cards, both care about assets with Doom on them. So now we can use Word of Weal on an asset without having to worry that we also have to clear that asset of the Doom somehow, because it's under Elle, and so we're fine. But there is one very important danger to be concerned with her weakness, because even if the Doom doesn't count towards the agenda while it's under Elle, as soon as you draw Deafening Silence, that Doom is going to get moved from your asset to the agenda, and so it still is going to cost you that round. This makes Deafening Silence a little bit more interesting, I think, or actually a lot more interesting, because it takes a Doom that might not have counted and now it does count. But on the other hand, I think this weakness is still manageable. It doesn't stop you from doing anything, but it does make Amina more of a high-risk investigator, which I actually kind of like. I feel like the Doom Mystic should be a high-risk investigator, because I feel like she does have that high-reward part sorted. So you're playing with a round, which is a lot, but on the other hand, you're getting so much economic advantage. Other cards that I think are very interesting to talk about are specifically assets that take more than one Doom, potentially, because of the ability to kind of mess with that, set them up with one Doom under Elle, and then quickly build the amount of Doom on there. So cards like Renfield, you can put a single Doom on them to get that +1 willpower and the resources, and then that is just good already. Just get a little bit of econ. With LA, you don't need to worry about your economy anymore if you're getting a free resource every turn from Renfield. You will need a Charisma to have both these in play, because Renfield will also take up that LA slot. But then, if you need more Doom, you can push Renfield a little higher and you will get a lot more money very quickly. Especially when you go into the Witching Hour, you can always just put another Doom on there. Which, speaking of which, do people know what I mean when I'm talking about the Witching Hour? It's a term that's used a lot in the Discord, so I kind of assumed that a lot of people will have already used it. But specifically, it's talking about the round of gameplay right before an agenda is about to advance. So, for example, if I have a 3 advancement agenda and there's 2 Doom on there, that's when I would call it the Witching Hour. And the reason for that is I want to play cards like Renfield and Arcane Initiate and other cards that add Doom in that round, because the agenda is going to advance next round anyway, and it doesn't matter if there's more Doom than it needs to advance. All the Doom in play is going to get wiped away when it advances anyway. So, for example, if I have a fresh David Renfield, I want to play him on 2 Doom out of 3, use them, add that Doom, and then the next round it's gonna add another Doom, so we have 4 out of 3, then we advance, because the agenda advancing isn't checked when I add Doom to Renfield, and that way I can get a free resource. Now, with Elle, this gets even more powerful, because I can just have a Renfield in play with 1 Doom on him all the time. It doesn't count against that threshold, and I don't have to wipe him away right before the agenda would otherwise advance. And not only that, I'm getting 1 resource a turn, but in the Witching Hour, I can actually get a second resource out of him. So LA is actually a pretty powerful economy engine when compared with Renfield, or when combined with Renfield. Don't sleep on this. Renfield is a very powerful economy engine already, and powering up even more like this, I think, is going to make Mystics very rich if they want to be. Okay, that's it about the Witching Hour. Back to some other assets that you could play with this. Neither of these really care about the skill value, but they could be useful, and I wanted to point them out. Arcane Initiate is kind of the classic Doom ally. One of the interesting things here is that you could slot her under LA, wait until the agenda advances to wipe away that Doom, and then swap her with something else, because she doesn't have to stay under there once the Doom is gone. Likewise with Bloodpact. Bloodpact is the permanent that gives you +3 willpower or +3 combat, but you have to add a Doom to it. Normally, a lot of Mystics will only use this in the Witching Hour, and use it to just get a power turn that turn. With LA, you could have at least one little backup turn where if you really need to pass one single test, this is the time to go for it. And I think that is actually nice to have, even if it's maybe not the main reason you're running LA, just to be able to kind of panic and go, I need to pass this test right now. I can't risk failing. Let me just get +3. Finally, LA, I think saying that it makes Moonlight Ritual better is a bit weird. The thing that matters here is that if you only have assets that are ever going to have one Doom on them, then you don't need Moonlight Ritual. But if you have something like a Renfield or the Abyssal Tome, that it could potentially get a lot of Doom, LA gives you more time to find your Moonlight Ritual and to protect you from accidentally advancing earlier. And so you're actually using your Moonlight Ritual for a lot of value, not just for the one Doom, which is something I mentioned in the Amina video. I don't want to just be spending Moonlight Ritual as an emergency cash to get 3 resources rebated. I want to actually get a bunch of Doom off the table with that. Finally, speaking of getting Doom off the table, one particular quirk of LA is even though she doesn't cast the assets not to take up slots, they are considered attached to her, and if she leaves play, so do those assets. If you have assets with multiple points of Doom on them, such that LA won't be able to negate all the Doom that's on there, and you really need to get rid of that before the agenda advances, getting rid of LA will ensure that those assets leave play. You could just kill her, take a damage or 2 horror, but calling in favors is also not a terrible idea in the same kind of vein, right? You get rid of a asset, maybe a sickle or dowsing rod that you've loaded up with Doom, and then find your David Renfield, put Renfield into play, LA's back in hand, you play her, you go about your business. I think this is a fantastic card. This is probably the biggest signpost of this is how Doom play looks now. It is safer, it is better, it is stronger, you get a skill value boost. This card is fantastic, and it is such an important card, and I'm very glad we get it this early in the spoiler season. Next up, we have Thieves Kit, also previewed by Mythosbusters. We are moving away from the weird, creepy, super special effects and into something a little bit more simple and straightforward, but that has a surprising amount of utility and corner cases that make it very good. Thieves Kit is a 0 XP, 3 cost rogue asset with a single intellect icon. It has the item, tool, and illicit traits, and takes up a hand slot. It uses 6 supplies, and it has an action, spend 1 supply, investigate. You may use agility instead of intellect for this investigation. If you succeed, gain 1 resource. Why do I keep these on me? Why, to be better informed regarding the unsavory methods of art thieves, of course. So, Thieves Kit, I think, is a good comparison to a rogue standout lockpicks. Now, lockpicks level 1 I think is a staple for many reasons, but comparing this to a level 1 card isn't entirely fair, and comparing it to a level 0 card actually feels a lot better. Because lockpicks level 1 add your agility to your intellect for this investigation rather than choosing between the two, but if you don't succeed by 2, you discard them. Also, lockpicks exhausts. Thieves Kit does not exhaust. So Thieves Kit is this very simple, not that flashy, but very useful way to get a couple of clues if you have a high agility and maybe a lower intellect. Though even if you have a high intellect, you might have a use for that research generation. Dr. Milan Christopher was a standout ally for a long time in the game, and getting additional resources for doing something you already want to be doing is very good. Do not sleep on that research generation. Even if you fail 1 of the 6 tests, which I think on a standard back you can pretty reliably pass 5 out of the 6 tests, that's like playing Burning the Midnight Oil on top of refunding this card entirely, right? You have paid 0 effectively for this card and gotten 2 resources back. Kaimani Jones, the rogue for this cycle, has 2 intellect and 5 agility, so they are definitely wanting to pack the Thieves Kit just to get some extra clues and help the team out with their higher agility, especially if you are trying to get that succeed by on their ability and thus stacking more boosts into their agility. So for example, The Moon, which is the Rogue Tarot card, can give them +1 agility, which also then helps them investigate. I kind of want to compare this card to Flashlight. They're both very simple, cheap investigate tools. Thieves Kit maybe doesn't sound very cheap, it's 3 resources, but it's going to rebate you a bunch of money. And they're both probably giving you a small boost. They're not making it possible to get very high shroud locations very easily. Flashlight has the upside that turning a 2 shroud location to a 0 shroud location almost always guarantees a success. And there are some other tricks you can do with it as well. But Thieves Kit has a lot going for it as well, such as that 6 supplies. Getting 6 uses out of this card seems very good. Another card that kind of reminds me of is Pilfer. Pilfer is a 4-cost event that you can use agility instead of intellect to investigate, and if you succeed you get 2 additional clues. So if you were currently playing Pilfer to try to make up for your lack of intellect and getting some extra clues to help the team out, consider running Thieves Kit as well, or perhaps instead. I can imagine Winifred players are very excited to see this card because it seems very good in her. Speaking of skill cards, or Winifred, by way of Winifred, Thieves Kit being an optional to replace your skill value is actually kind of interesting. For a long time, one of the things is that Watch This, which is a pretty nice skill to get economy in Rogue, doesn't work with lockpicks, because even though lockpicks add your agility to your intellect for the test, it is still an intellect test, and so Watch This doesn't have a matching icon. Thieves Kit makes it an agility test, so you can commit Watch This. If you have a very low shroud location, it might be a great way to get even more money out of this ability. But let's say one of your teammates has a deduction that they want to commit to your test. You could actually just test with intellect instead, and maybe you just have a few random icons lying around that'll help you pass that test, getting the extra clue. So I actually think the fact that this says may is quite useful. I could imagine someone like Schizo Tool, who usually wants to be testing agility, switching back to intellect, just to get a couple of extra skill cards in there when the needs be. Cards like Manual Dexterity and Perception just furthering this idea. Finally, we have already seen I'll Take That, one of the other cards from this cycle, being a card that lets you put item asset into play for cheap if you can successfully investigate. Works both ways with the Thieves Kit. You can put a Thieves Kit in for free if you can succeed by X a lot, or otherwise you can use the Thieves Kit to put in a different item if you can succeed with that. So I really like that. I really enjoy kind of the way that this deck kind of builds itself, and they are also both illicit cards, which keeps the hope alive that there are going to be some cards that care about illicit in this cycle. And speaking of traits, it is also a tool card, which one of the 5 triple class assets from Edge of the Earth cares about, Crafty. And just every time I see new cards, I see more ways for Crafty to be useful, it feels like. Because this card kind of started out middle of the pack, not that high on my radar, and the more I see of it, the more I'm like, yeah, this card's really good, right? If you're worried about your Thieves Kit maybe not passing you all those investigates and you need to get that high shroud location, play Crafty, get +2. Pay for 2 of the resources from it with Crafty and get yourself even more money back with it. Seems very fun. And I'm looking forward to seeing more tools, more illicit cards. Seems very good. But we're not quite done with rogue assets that help us investigate, because next up we have Damning Testimony from Drawn to the Flame. So Damning Testimony is a 4-cost customizable asset in the rogue faction that is one intellect icon. It has the item and illicit traits. It takes up a hand slot. It uses 3 evidence and has an action to exhaust Damning Testimony and choose an enemy at any location to investigate your location. If you succeed, you may spend 1 evidence to discover an additional clue at the chosen enemy's location. This card I think compares very nicely to Fingerprint Kit. I think Fingerprint Kit as it sits is generally going to be a little bit better, which is a 4-cost asset that gives a +1 intellect boost and an additional clue all in one. But Damning Testimony actually has a couple of side points where it does actually feel a little bit better. The main one being that you don't actually have to spend the evidence to use the ability. So if you fail, you don't lose one of your charges. You don't lose one of your evidence. In addition, the ability to spread clues out over the map seems very nice in solo. In multiplayer, I can imagine you just want to have your Fingerprint Kit and go away at one location. But I actually don't mind this card in solo at all. I think it's very good. It does exhaust and it doesn't give any kind of stop boost. So comparing it to lockpicks, I do feel like lockpicks maybe takes it for now. But of course it is customizable, so we can spend XP to boost it. If you're confused about how customizable works and you've missed this, go back. I've got a video, I'll link it in the top right now, where you can see exactly how this keyword works. And so there's, I think, right now, just looking at this card, there's one character who I really would want to play with Finn, and that's Trish. And the reasoning, I think, is pretty obvious. You can use one evidence to either get a second clue at that enemy's location or to automatically evade that enemy, which lets you maybe move in there and get more clues, avoid fighting. A lot of fun stuff. I think this is a good card for Trish, even at this level, but of course we have lots of ways to spend XP to make this card better. Starting out, we have Search Warrant. While investigating using Damning Testimony, you may ignore any effect or keyword on the investigated location that would trigger. Now, important, that doesn't mean you have to spend any evidence to do this. Again, you can just exhaust this as long as there's an enemy in play. I'm pretty sure you do need an enemy in play, otherwise you're not allowed to do this, but you can just ignore keywords on your location. This is the ability of Read the Signs. I think Read the Signs sees a lot of play, just as like an extra deduction in a Mystic deck usually, but I think it is actually quite good occasionally and situationally to be able to ignore those keywords. And I think that's a great spot for a 1 XP upgrade on a customizable card to sit. If you're playing the Circle Undone, where haunted keywords show up everywhere and there's lots of abilities on locations you don't want to have triggering, this seems like a great 1 XP purchase to get. And if you're not playing that campaign and you're not that worried about it, you just skip over it. It's fine. Next up, we have Fabricated Evidence, ding, which makes Damning Testimony enter play with 2 additional evidence on it, as well as Blackmail. You get +2 intellect while investigating using Damning Testimony. It's actually remarkably difficult to find like a comparable asset for this set of upgrades. The closest thing that I came to is kind of just looking at the standard Mystic upgrades, which give +2 willpower when they're upgraded to level 2 or level 3. And then this looks pretty great to me. Just having an asset that, again, you don't need to spend any evidence to use it. You can exhaust it, you just get +2 intellect while investigating with it. Seems good for a lot of the higher intellect rogues. Like I'm thinking Finn, who can take this up to level 5 because it is illicit, seems like a fantastic user to just be testing at 6 most of the time and getting clues, and he's more likely to leave enemies behind anyway because he's evading a lot. Next up we have Extort. Well, when you successfully investigate using Damning Testimony, you may spend 1 evidence to automatically evade the chosen enemy. This is a trick that we've seen before with breaking and entering, and in fact Trish's ability. And I think this is a great use of 1 evidence if you have enough of it. So you maybe want Fabricated Evidence, ding, to have 2 more. The use case here is pretty limited, or not pretty limited, but pretty situational. But I think you'll know it when you need it, right? If there's a big hunter enemy coming after you, you can just spend 1 evidence. And keep in mind, you don't have to spend the second evidence to get that clue. If you only care about the evade, you can investigate your location, evade that enemy, and that only costs you 1 evidence. So I think this is a pretty powerful upgrade. Next up, we have Surveil. Surveil is a 3 XP upgrade. You may use Damning Testimony's ability to investigate the chosen enemy's location instead of your location. Again, without using additional evidence. This card just reads, while there's an enemy in play, exhaust it, you can now investigate that location instead of your own location. Combine that with Blackmail and you've got... I mean, I want to compare it to 6th Sense level 4, which is a 4 XP card. This is 5 XP spread for 2 copies, so kind of the equivalent of a 3 XP card, to just investigate any location in play that there's an enemy at. That's going to be campaign dependent. I know not every campaign has maps where enemies are going to kind of walk around or keep staying around, but I'm thinking about Innsmouth right now, and there's multiple maps where I could very easily see enemies at location I want to investigate, and instead of having to go over there and evade them or kill them and then get their clues, I can just stand somewhere else, surveil them, get the +2 from Blackmail, and I never have to enter that location again. It seems very good. I'm also thinking actually Echoes of the Past in Carcosa, where all the locations get opened up by the cultist. That seems so good. Finally, we have Expose, which is a 4 XP upgrade. When you successfully investigate using Damning Testimony, you may spend X evidence to discard the chosen enemy if it is non-elite. X is that enemy's remaining health. Now, I think this is actually a little underwhelming because of the scarcity of evidence. If you have Fabricated Evidence, ding, you have 5 evidence to play with, but even then you're not going to be using this to just get rid of a random 2 health enemy. The 2 use cases that I could think of were Acolytes. Acolytes are often going to spawn far away from you and they only have 1 health. Wizard of the Order, I guess, 2 health and tends to have multiple doom on them, so that's also still fine. The idea basically being that you don't have to run all the way over there to spend your evidence, but even then I think this will this is a different use for this card than a lot of the other modes where you were trying to use this to investigate. You're now using this to try to deal with enemies, which is an unusual kind of side grade, but I'm kind of here for it. And the other trick that I thought about is actually sleight of hand. Damning Testimony is an item, and so you can sleight of hand it into play. If you have, enough evidence, you could investigate once, get rid of a reasonable sized enemy, spending all your evidence, but you don't care about that, and then it goes back to hand at the end of the turn. You can play it again, having refilled it on evidence. That seems like a neat little trick if you want to try to go in that direction. It seems like good for maybe a solo if you're like panicking, but I hope that you'd have better options. I just think that spending 4 cost on this asset and only discarding like 1 enemy and getting 1 extra clue isn't really worth it. So that enemy has to be really important for you to use it, or you otherwise have to be manipulating the amount of evidence you get somehow. Here's one more time with all the upgrades. Please go check out their podcast if you have any questions or like want to hear them talk about it more. I kind of went through this very quickly because they already did a fantastic podcast about the ins and outs of this card. So go ahead and give it a listen. And then we have one more card, Fighting Lesson, from the Whisperer in Darkness. It is a 0 XP Guardian skill card with a combat, agility and wild icon. It is practice traded, so Amanda can take it. And it says commit only to a skill test during an attack or evasion attempt. You can commit the skill to an investigator's test at any location. Aim and pull the damn trigger, kid. It ain't hard. Oh, sorry. Aim and pull the damn trigger. It ain't hard, kid. And that's probably Leo Anderson there, giving shooting lessons to somebody. So I think this card is fine. Having skill cards that care about attacks or evasion attempts are definitely in the Guardian wheelhouse, as we see with Daring. The thing that I'm a little skeptical about is that this card is very narrow and doesn't give me all the icons that I want, right? I really would like this to have another wild icon, or maybe, even just another combat and agility icon. I just want this to be a little bit better because as it sits right now, it doesn't draw me any cards. And so it's kind of like that Unexpected Courage. Now it does have this upside of being able to commit to any investigator's test at any location, which I was initially like, how important is that? But the more people talked about it, the more I realized that it does have some utility, especially when it comes to evasion, right? It's unlikely that somebody's going to be trying to make a big attack and not really have the boost to back it up. It happens occasionally, especially if you have rogues which succeed by X weapons, but a lot of the time they're going to have the tools they need to make that test land. But evasion happens a lot more when you're like panicking and scrambling and maybe you're away from your team, in which case the ability to commit this from a different location is very useful. And so if your Seeker's suddenly caught out with a big monster on them and they just need to evade it so they can get out of there and you can catch up to them later and deal with that monster, Fighting Lesson actually seems to be a pretty nice card for that situation. Now, I don't play enough 4-player to know how often that situation actually comes up, so people who play that more are going to have to tell me. As it sits, it's not a card that I'd be super excited to play in 2-player, but I can see why people might be trying this card. It seems neat, if nothing else. And one thing that I wanted to mention, because the criticism that I leveled against Fighting Lessons is the same one that I leveled against Helping Hand, which is that they don't draw you any cards. And to me, drawing cards is a big part of skill cards, right? Overpower, manual dexterity, perception. A big reason to run these cards is because they draw you cards and they help your deck achieve consistency. However, somebody pointed out that maybe we're getting a sort of a boxing gloves equivalent, but for skill cards in Guardian. Guardians having fight events used to be kind of, not a thing that people were really interested in because they were mostly using big guns and big weapons. But then Nathaniel Cho came out with his boxing gloves and suddenly this different strategy opened up around this one asset that really supported that playstyle. Something like that could happen again because Carson is probably not running around with a big gun. Maybe he is, but we haven't seen that yet. And if he isn't, maybe whatever he's holding in his hands could be used to support this skill-based playstyle. If that asset lets you draw cards or even just search for more skills after you've committed the skill test to somebody else, that would really fix, I think, the main issue I have with these cards. And at that point, I think all of them look a lot more appealing to me as cards I'd want to run to try and help my team in whatever situations I need, because I know I'm going to get rewarded for it. So yeah, that's all the cards I have for you today. More cards are definitely coming, so make sure to stay subscribed. Comments are always welcome. Join the Discord, discord.gg/mythosbusters, and stay watching, stay hyped for Arkham, because I'll be seeing you until the end of time.